Design. It's part of a series of meetings online and in person to talk about our local plan for Winchester City Council. It's part of Your Place, Your Plan, and we're really pleased to welcome our guests today. We believe there are about 90 people on this call. So first of all, I just ask you, if you aren't speaking or intending to speak in the next few seconds, we'd be really grateful if you'd mute your microphone so that it doesn't disturb others as we're going through today. And the second thing is it's being recorded. So if you don't want your face to be recorded, please do. You're welcome to switch your camera off, but it'll be recorded so that we can use it as evidence in the local plan process. So good morning. My name's Jackie Porter. I'm the Cabinet Member for Place and the Local Plan. And I'm here on this call with Adrian Fox, who's leading the team at Winchester City Council, who are creating the next local plan, and his team, and also two guests, Andy von Bradsky and Helen Goodwin, who are our lead speakers today, our expert speakers. Their names are up on the screen, so you can see who they are. Helen has been helping us with our workshops, which we did, I think, over a year ago now. I think the COVID times has made us all think about whether time has passed quickly or slowly, but it seems quite quickly. And Andy is a director of Von Bradsky and Enterprises, but also was the key officer running the National Design Code, and who we use in Winchester to ensure that our design quality and aspirations are as high as we possibly can make them. So I'm going to pass over now to Adrian. I think Adrian might want to say a few words, but throughout the whole thing, if you have any questions, I'd be grateful if you put them in the chat, and then at the appropriate times we'll stop and I'll collate those and try and make sure that we're not asking the same thing through 2 or 3 times, but you have your opportunity to put your point if we at the end of each speaker's section, and then hopefully if we have a few moments at the end, we'll have time for a small amount of discussion. Thank you very much, and over to Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Porter. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. It's really good to see so many people on the call, and that so many people are passionate about design, because it's something that we are very passionate about at the City Council. So as Councillor Porter mentioned, we are part of our Regulation 18 consultation. We're running this specialised event and one other. They are basically focused on design. So our consultation on our Reg 18 plan runs from the 2nd of November to the 14th of December. Please do have a look at it, and I'll go through some more details just in a moment about what it includes on design and how we want to raise the bar on the issue of design. So next slide, please. So in terms of the staircase, where we are in the process, we consulted last year on the strategic issues and priorities document. We analysed the comments, and now we're basically at the have your say on the draft Regulation 18 local plan. And obviously from there, we'll move up the staircase towards obviously submission of the local plan examination. So next slide, please. So an integral part of our local plan is high quality, well-designed places and living well. And we've got a dedicated topic on this particular topic. The way the local plan is structured is that we have a strategic policy, which is an overarching policy. We've identified what the key issues are, and some of that came from really helpful response that we got from the public consultation events and obviously the design workshops that we'll go into a bit more detail. And then obviously there's development management policies and specific site allocations policies, and they're all centered around various topics. So next slide, please. So how's the local plan changed? Now, this is really important. Basically, we did some Design Southeast workshops, which Helen will go into some more details about how we can really raise the bar on design. And there's several different ways that we've done that. We wanted to basically make it very clear that it's all about a design process. And that was a very key message that came out of the workshops, was that good design comes from a process, and the process needs to be documented about how you've reached certain decisions to reach certain designs or layouts of a site. The town forum, the discussions we had with them about how we could improve the local plan on the design issue were an integral part of that. And we've taken on board the feedback that we've got from obviously those workshops to really embed high quality design into the new local plan. So next slide, please. And it's a critical part of good placemaking and something that's often overlooked as kind of when you get into the scheme of things. We basically want to make sure that you think about design and you think about it from different angles. So you need to think about climate change and adaptation, because obviously that's a key priority for the City Council in terms of obviously how we move towards net zero. And also, it's really important for people's health and well-being, and that's very apparent as a result of obviously the COVID pandemic, where obviously exercise and people's open space, their well-being, their gardens they live in, is really important. So what we did was we took all that advice and we built it into the Regulation 18 plan. And next slide, please. Like I say, it all comes back to the design process, and that should be a circular process that you go through at different stages of your work to come up with a layout, a design, an idea, and basically you should be testing it and challenging it at different stages. Now, the way I see it is that you need to, as part of that design process, put on different hats when you're looking at that. So you need to think about obviously how the site is laid out in terms of its orientation for obviously solar gain. You need to think about it in terms of obviously access to public transport. Is it clear and legible? Um, are there things to do with flooding that you need to address? What about obviously nature conservation and biodiversity net gain? So you need to be thinking about this as part of the design process and challenging yourself as you go through it. And that's an integral part of the Regulation 18 plan that we've built in the word design process into every topic of the local plan. Next slide, please. So what can the local plan do? Well, it's clearly one of those really important tools about how we can shape where we live, work and spend our leisure time. But obviously, we need to set out clear planning policies about how developers need to follow that, and obviously to follow a sound design process. And obviously, take into account the relationship of the buildings and spaces and the landscape and the surrounding areas, and obviously achieve good permeability to really basically encourage people to use public transport rather than perhaps being a dark alley down the corner of a site. And importantly, a key message that came out of the workshop was about creating local distinctiveness. And that's obviously a key part of the National Model Design Code. And obviously, how the building is constructed. Now, that obviously will change over the plan period, which goes to 2039, when obviously we're talking about different ways that buildings will be constructed in the future. And that's an integral part of the obviously the discussion and debate that you need to have as part of the design process. Next slide, please. Community engagement is a central plank of obviously how we want to obviously raise the bar of design in Winchester District. And basically, if it doesn't go through this iterative kind of inclusive process, it will fail because basically you haven't got the buy-in of local residents. You haven't obviously thought about the different ways that you need to evolve and develop the design. And on the slide there, there's some key things that obviously we want developers and land promoters to think about. Obviously, net zero carbon is obviously a fundamental requirement of obviously our new local plan because we've got energy efficiency targets that require LETI energy efficiency targets, but also obviously about cycling and walking and obviously the arrangement of space. And the arrangement of space is becoming really important in terms of obviously not only the look and feel of development, but obviously how people use it and how it addresses local issues. Next slide, please. The design process must go hand in hand with carbon neutrality because obviously we've got a climate emergency. We need to think about how we can obviously adapt and change designs to obviously recognise that. And it's not the only tool we've got, but obviously it's a really important tool. So we put in the local plan a lot stronger policies about how you must obviously address obviously carbon neutrality and carbon change. And the key process is, or it must come back to the design process. Next slide, please. This slide here kind of shows how integral the design process is when you put on your different hats. So when you're thinking about climate mitigation, the factors that you need to obviously consider as part of the design process, and the factors that you need to think about with climate adaptation. We're all very familiar with obviously the very hot summer that we had this year, and obviously how we need to think about that in design and development of sites, and obviously creating multifunctional areas that obviously have tree planting, biodiversity net gain, and also more importantly, obviously because we're having extreme temperatures, think about shading and overheating. And it all comes back to the design process and having that circular integral process that we need developers to follow. Next slide, please. So the position and the orientation of the buildings can influence the amount of solar gain, and we've got a picture there of Winchester University where they've used fenestration there to obviously help deflect some of the sunlight. But also it's important in terms of the potential carbon emissions of a site, because what we don't want buildings to do is overheat and obviously rely on mechanical ventilation. We want them to think about that in terms of their shading and overshadowing. And obviously, paramount in everybody's minds is obviously the cost of energy and heating bills. So, and we need to consider that as part of the design process, because obviously we want to obviously make sure that these houses that people live in are affordable. But also people's mental health. Obviously, the more natural daylight you can have in a house helps people's obviously mood, their physical well-being, and obviously we need to think about that as part of the design process. Next slide, please. The other hat we need to think about is obviously how we think about the design process with sustainable travel. We really want to prioritise the use of sustainable transport modes over and above the car. And one of the key changes that we've got with the Regulation 18 plans is that we haven't got defined car parking standards. Instead, basically, the policy requires developers to think as part of the design process to demonstrate the number of car parking spaces that are applicable to that site. And more importantly, how can the site be linked to public rights of way and cycle routes? Now, we do appreciate that in some parts of the rural parts of the district, this may not be achievable, but we don't want developments designed around the car and the cars dominating obviously the layout and the design. And how can we use the plan to promote obviously the concept of 15-minute neighbourhoods and to promote active travel and to obviously link together communities and settlements in a sustainable, hopefully low carbon way. Next slide, please. We have, as part of the local plan Regulation 18, we've developed a new local plan website, and we'll be circulating these slides after the presentation. And we've changed the layout of that to hopefully make it easy to understand and kind of people to comment on this Regulation 18 plan. Next slide, please. We want people to get involved in the Regulation 18 plan to say whether or not we've got the draft policies on designs right, or whether or not there's room for improvements. And the main thing we want people to do is comment on the Regulation 18 through a platform called Citizen Space, and there's a QR code there that you can scan to take you straight to it. And the main thing is that if you do that, we can make sure that we actually match your comment against the right policy. And obviously we can have your ideas about how potentially we could improve those policies. And there's a short video on that website about how you can enter your comments on Citizen Space rather than emailing us or writing this in, because then we've got to interpret what everybody says in terms of, is it against this policy or that policy? Next slide, please. And as I said, achieving high quality sustainable design is all about how we put on obviously our carbon neutrality hat on. We've got another event next week, so it's a little plug for that, about setting the standard for net zero carbon homes, which is an integral part of the Regulation 18, and feel free to sign up to that. But hopefully that's a short snapshot flavour of the Regulation 18 plan, but I would encourage you to read the local plan and help us to improve how we can really raise the bar on design. Next slide, please. And I'll now hand over to Helen from Design South East. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you for that introduction. And it's what's really great for me to hear in Adrian's introduction is that we are all very much singing from the same hymn sheet today about the importance of design quality and design processes for really raising the bar. So I'm really delighted to be here today to contribute to this consultation event. Thank you. Next slide. I'm just going to talk very briefly about who I am, who we are at Design South East, a little bit about the stakeholder engagement workshops that we carried out. It was a year ago now, time flies, and about design as a process and a collaborative process, and when things go wrong, when that process isn't carried out in a rigorous way. And then just about some of the tools for checks and balances, most importantly, design review. Thank you. Next slide. So my name's Helen Goodwin. I'm head of programs at Design South East. We are a not-for-profit organisation that supports local authorities with local authorities and their stakeholders, so developers, consultants, landowners, communities, whoever it may be that is invested in the process of good placemaking. We've been operating for 25 years. We started out in a corner of Kent, and we've now grown to cover the whole of this region. It's actually an amalgamation of the sort of historic southeast and east regions, and also London. So we operate across 14 counties. We work with over 60 local authorities, and over the time that we've been operating, we've probably seen about 2,000 plus developments have come past our panels. That means that we will have impacted the lives of probably 10 million or more stakeholders, I think, because if you think of the scale of the projects that we see, there might be single homes in the countryside, there might be new settlements of 10,000 or so new homes. The impact that our organisation has is hopefully profound, and through raising the bar on design. But importantly, the point I wanted to make in this is that One Planet, what we do is for the people who are going to use these spaces, it's about a delivery of social value. We're a not-for-profit organisation, but importantly, it's about ensuring that good design and sustainable design are synonymous. They are one and the same thing. Thank you. So a year ago, we were commissioned by Winchester to carry out 3 workshops to support them with the development of their local plan, and importantly, to focus on design policy within the local plan. We carried out 3 workshops. The first of those, in fact, some of you who are here on the call today may have been with us in those workshops, so if so, nice to see you. The first workshop focused on an invited guest list of local stakeholders who use Winchester's design guides and policy. The second workshop focused on Winchester City, and it was for local communities and residents from the city area. The third went outside of the city area to look at the market towns and rural villages. And we had a fantastic time workshopping, gathering ideas, mapping, really scrutinising what works and what doesn't about Winchester here and now, really getting people's input into the things that they value, the qualities that they value about their place, and where there may be areas for improvement going forwards. And next slide, please. I'm really pleased to say that as a result of those workshops, we synthesised all of the information into 2 reports which are available for you to read. I really recommend that you read the reports to see the full scope of the information that we gathered from local people. But they've been synthesised and translated here, and they're actually incorporated in the draft local plan. So we're really pleased that those workshops have actually been a really strong part of the evidence base for the development of the new local plan. Next slide, please. So those workshops were really all about focusing on raising the bar on design. And I think if there's one thing that I'm most pleased about, next slide, it's that Adrian's mantra has now become this importance of design as a process. Looking through the draft, I don't know how many references there are to design process, but it is literally peppered with references to design process. And I think that's, a really fantastic thing, because Adrian is absolutely right to have picked up from those workshops that design is all about the process. Sure, we're all aiming to aspire to achieving well-designed places. That's the point of the design and planning process that we go through. But unless there's a rigorous design process that underpins that, we will not end up with the highly refined designs that are real fit for place that we're looking for through these processes. Thank you. Next slide. So the government has been raising the bar on design too, and Andy's going to come on to talk a little bit more about that. But underpinning the work that we did with local people through those workshops were these 2 documents, the National Design Guide, which was published in 2018, and then the more recent National Model Design Code in 2021. Thank you. Next slide. Design process is very much a part of those documents. They iterate this importance of well-designed places and buildings come about when a rigorous design process evolves into a design proposal. Next slide. The National Design Guide sets out 10 characteristics of a well-designed place, and you can see it here drawn out as a wheel. All of the characteristics fall under these 3 headings of climate, character and community, which are what we must always hold in our minds. And again, Adrian has talked about that, those aspects of achieving net zero and affordable homes and so on that are so important to Winchester's new local plan. But these 10 characteristics come together, they overlap, and they are all, I think if any of us think about a well-designed place, if we think about these qualities of identity, the built form, the character of the built form, the coherence, the ease of movement around and so on, we can really relate to these being important elements of well-designed places. The important thing to highlight in terms of design process is that it really is all about context, context, context. Now, that's one of the characteristics you'll see at the top there at sort of 1 o'clock. But these qualities, these characteristics are really very valuable as a starting place for any design process, to think about the qualities of the existing place from these points of view as well. But it all comes back to context and to a really rigorous site analysis at the very start of the process. And that will be looking at the identity of the place, its past, its present, what's there now, how people live there, how they move around. All of that aspect of a really rigorous site analysis that is then going to underpin the design process moving forwards. Thank you. This is translated in the Winchester Local Plan into a sort of 6-stage process, and I've just picked out here stage 1, stage 3 and stage 5, which is the analysis, visioning and testing, because Adrian's described a couple of times this circular process. I think the important point is that it's not a linear process from A to B in terms of achieving at the end point. Sometimes there's a bit of a mystery, I think, for people who don't necessarily come from a design background about how design comes about. We often think about design as a thing. We often say, I like that, I don't like that. But design is so much more than whether we like something. It's of course, the aesthetic value is very important, but it's very much about how a place works and functions for the people, how it supports quality of life, how it enhances the environment and so on. So this iterative process of analysis, visioning and testing, these stages, that it's maybe not circular. Next slide. It's iterative. And I love this diagram. This is drawn by an architect, David Drishna. And I think it's a drawing about how architects get from start to finish. And I think it's very, very descriptive of the complexities and challenges of achieving a really high quality of design that the architect as designer will go through as part of that design process. Next slide, please. However, design is a collaborative process, and that's another important point to get across. It is about knowledge sharing. It's about bringing together multidisciplinary expertise. It's about bringing together public and private sector knowledge. Importantly, it's about local knowledge and expertise as well. Design is not something that should be being done to people. It should be being done with them, because it is the local people who will live with these designs in the longer term. And it is a process that involves multiple stakeholders. Next slide. Multiple stakeholders, of course, can mean multiple interests, and there are just a few of them set out there. But of course, you've got invested in these projects, developers who will be looking to make money, communities who may not want a new development in the fields at the end of their gardens, planners who may have a particular agenda, and architects who are trying to sort of navigate all of these different stakeholder interests. So the design process, really, next slide, please, is about bringing all those people around the table and making sure that the best designs can only come about through shared knowledge and collaboration. Next slide, please. Importantly, the design process is about creating shared aspirations. And importantly, those shared aspirations must include the local community. And Adrian has already talked about the importance of involving the local community. Indeed, he's gone so far as to say that a project that hasn't involved the local community will not be approved. Next slide, please. The reason for involving the local community is that their local knowledge and expertise is something that the other consultants involved in the project may not have access to without their involvement. So it's incredibly critically important that we make sure that we work with communities in the design process. Thank you. Next slide. One of the reasons for involving communities is really to bring them on board. And this quote that I've included here from one of the community engagement workshops that we carried out, this wasn't from Winchester, was from elsewhere, was one of the community members saying, I think one of the key things is turning a community around from being absolutely against it, against the development that is, to now seeing how they can positively shape a great new place. This is a job well done and continuing to be well done through engaging them in the ongoing process. And I mention ongoing process because ideally engagement with local people is a continuous process. It's not a one-stop thing. You ask them once and then go away and do it, but you involve them iteratively throughout the process to make sure that what's coming forward is a proposal that is going to be locally popular. And that's probably a term I imagine that Andy is going to talk about when he talks about design coding in a moment. Thank you. Next slide. The other important point to make is that design in planning is a collaborative process too. I think design for busy local authority departments who are all dealing with their own particular agendas, highways or communities or environment or whatever, design often feels as if it's something that sits outside of those departments and is something that sits solely with development management to approve or refuse. In fact, design is the thing that brings all of these aspects together. I think in Winchester's local plan, its strategic objectives of living well, tackling the climate emergency, creating a greener district, creating homes for all, and a vibrant local economy. These are things that, of course, are on the agenda of so many different departments within the local authority. So getting everybody invested in design and embedding a design culture across the local authority is also a really important aspect of this. And I know that Winchester are working hard, for example, engaging Design South East, the planning department engaging Design South East to carry out the workshops is a really fantastic sign that Winchester is really invested in embedding a design culture across the council. Next slide, please. That's just illustrating design and planning as a joined up thing. So the National Planning Policy Framework says that development that is not well designed should be refused. So how can those responsible for making those decisions know when a design is good or not? So the National Design Guide and the National Design Code are toolkits, tools that design teams and planners can use to try to enhance design quality through the process. But there are other tools and mechanisms. Next slide, please. And one of the tools that the NPPF recommends is the use of design review processes to help local authorities to assess design, and indeed it says that they should include any recommendations made by design review panels. So design review sits at the heart of what we do at Design South East, and we carry out design reviews across the whole of the South East, as I've indicated. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So design review effectively brings to the table a panel of expert, multidisciplinary, so that doesn't just mean the architects, but likely to involve, importantly, the landscape architects, but a plethora of other consultants too, sustainability, communities, structural engineers, and so on. There will be a range of different experts that are brought around the table. Importantly, the panel is an independent panel from the local authority and the applicant team, so its impartiality is a really essential part of this process, bringing a collaborative approach to bring everybody together, constructive advice. Our role is only advisory, but it is a really key tool to give confidence. Next slide, please. Good design ultimately underpins the creation of successful, sustainable places and communities. Design review, endorsed by the NPPF, is a really important part of design quality management processes. It brings a range of skills and perspectives that are not always available internally in local authorities. And I know that there are some great urban designers and other specialists within the Winchester City Council, but this is not always the case. So the panel is able to review and assess schemes against design codes or against design guidance. This can give members confidence in decision-making processes. Sometimes we find that there can be a kind of conflict between the members' opinion and maybe sometimes not a full trust that the officers are giving the right advice. More often than not, in design review, we're endorsing everything that the planners have said, but it's that independence that gives confidence. Ultimately, the design review process is for the benefit of the public, of the people who are going to be living there. So our focus is on the outcomes, about living well, ultimately, and the benefits for the environment. And it's to demonstrate to local people that decisions are objective and transparent, and that it can build trust, as I've shown by bringing communities into the process. It can build trust in the planning process. Next slide, please. So good design benefits everybody. It enhances values, it speeds up planning processes, it delivers environmental benefits, and importantly, it improves health and well-being. It's fantastic, next slide please, that the Winchester local plan puts living well at the heart of its aspirations from high quality and well-designed places. We're really pleased to have supported the council with developing their new local plan, which we think sets the bar really high already in terms of design process. And I'm delighted to take questions when we get to that point in the process. I think there's one last slide just to say thank you.
Do I take over at this point? Thank you. Like Helen, thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very much, Adrian, and good afternoon, everybody. A really great pleasure to be invited to contribute to this important event, something I'm really passionate about, and I'm delighted to be helping Winchester in some of the work that they're doing outside of this particular activity. A word about myself. I am helping a number of local authorities at the moment deliver on some of the commitments that I helped shape when I was in what was then called the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government as Head of Architecture. 5 years there, and it resulted in some really great outputs, which I'm very proud of, and I'm helping other local authorities, as I say, to deliver on those guidance notes. I've a background in housing, regeneration and sustainability, which I won't go through, but that has helped shape me, and this is what I know as an architect is most important, design quality. The subject for today, I think it might be preaching to a number of the converted, but Adrian's asked me very specifically to speak about design quality, what that means, but in specific reference to design coding and how you might take what you've done to the next level. And then I'll give a quick summary of some of the ingredients that go into delivering that. Next slide. Next slide. I have to applaud you for what I think is a great document. In Regulation 18 consultation plan puts design quality and living well right at the centre of it. And if you think about what good design is, it's actually the whole of this document. It's not just that particular chapter. You have to actually read all of it to understand how design shapes every aspect of what's in there. And Adrian's gone through all the component parts, and Helen's talked about the process, but actually you need to, I think, read all of this document to understand just how central design is. Next slide. We've talked about these documents, government obviously placing quality right high up on the agenda at the moment, and it's great that we have a Secretary of State that continues with that commitment. The NPPF, of course, revised and issued last year, which actually placed emphasis on design quality. There's lots of documents that sit behind that in planning practice guidance that can be referred to, and as Helen said, can be used to determine whether something is good quality or not. It's important, though, in terms of the reference to design codes, to look at the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill recommendations. There's a lot more that needs to come out from this particular document, but it does make reference to the importance of design codes in determining quality, and requires all local authorities to produce area-wide design codes, which of course need a little bit of explanation and an understanding of what that actually means. Next slide. We've talked about this as well. I'm really proud of how we got this particular diagram circulating around a lot of local authorities at the moment, using this as their benchmark and their springing off point. And of course, it does tell you what government views as being important to consider in terms of what a well-designed place might be. And the pleasing thing for me is about character, community and climate, the 3 C's being a really important ingredient woven through all the other 10 ingredients. Next slide. Talking about the challenges, I showed this slide at the workshops that Helen and I attended in the first instance to talk about this, and in fact more ingredients have been added subsequently to what are the problems that we often face, and also what are the new challenges. So, you know, I don't need to go through all of this, but a character, sense of place, the importance of designing to a context, understanding the importance of reducing car dependency, walkability, the environmental impacts, how landscape is often degraded within schemes coming forward, and the need to invest in social and physical infrastructure. New design challenges coming forward. Net zero, obviously right high up there on the agenda, that probably 2 years ago, 3 years ago, wasn't as significant as it now is. The post-pandemic issues around health and well-being, the need to enhance our natural environment, a really key issue for settlements that are within a natural environment. Travel modes and the importance and the change of technologies that are coming forward. The need to avoid encroachment on green land wherever possible, and the need to have intensification, urban intensification. And to add to all of that is the latest in terms of affordability and cost of living. So these ingredients are really fundamental to how local plans development and the focus on quality needs to be reflected. Next slide. I'm just going to refer to a few sort of key sort of messages that are coming through. I think it's grand that you put living well in the title, because it's not just about how a scheme is designed and what the components are to it, but it's also about the quality of life that that engenders. And I just sort of encourage you to look at the Quality of Life Foundation reports and recommendations, which really go hand in glove a bit with the 10 characteristics and support it, but also focus mainly on the residents and the people who use places and their experience. Next slide. There's also a very significant focus on building on health and well-being. And this isn't just about physical health, but it's also about mental health. It's about social engagement, how a sense of society and belonging is important. And there's a really good checklist, I would describe it as, for this, produced by Design for Homes and working with Public Health England as then was. So that's another good guide to look at. Next slide. And I'm delighted that you've embraced as a local authority the recommendations of the Letty report, probably the most ambitious and significant of all the requirements for net zero, and that sets out some pretty strict and onerous requirements that need to be woven through all developments into the future. Next slide. So just a bit now about design codes and guides. One of the key aspects of any design quality in the planning system documentation that will be referred to by an inspector or Secretary of State needs to be the local design guides and the local design criteria. And I have to again applaud Winchester. They have a good suite of design quality related documents covering conservation area, character area, appraisals. Particularly impressed with the village design statements that exist and local area design statements. The ambition to produce design codes and master plans is something that I'll go through, and I don't want to touch on anything that Adrian or Helen has said about design process, but it's particularly important and significant, I think, that has been bedded in the local plan requirement. And I think, in my view, it's a model for the country, a model for how other local authorities could use that design process to support their local plan quality objectives. Next slide. So a bit about design codes and guides. You have a guide, Essex Design Guide is another typical one. These are guides that provide guidance on how development can be carried out with good design practice. The difference with design codes is that guides tend to be general aspirations, which might or might not be sort of applied locally, whereas a design code is a specific set of illustrated requirements with measurable, detailed parameters for the physical development of a site or area. So they are much more specific, and so in a sense there's a need to move from the guidance to actually specific requirements for specific sites. Next slide. So a local design code could be at a number of scales, as the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill requires. Local authorities need to look at local authority wide guides, but this is quite a challenge. It can touch on strategy, it can touch on almost guidance. It could be quite specific for large scale interventions. But design codes need to be also thought of defined areas within a local authority. So allocated sites, regeneration areas, village extensions, and there are plenty of examples within the Reg 18 of areas where the specific design code could be applied. There's also a design code that could be applied to area types, that is, areas or typologies or parts of a town that have a similar characteristic, and that could be then coded for any extensions or improvements or a vision to change those. And of course, we're used to design codes for large scale developments, for urban extensions, for new settlements that might be delivered over a specific time frame. And the local authorities will be very familiar with those, so too will developers. But here we're talking about what are codes that could be fitted within a local plan and delivered alongside development. So next slide. Like design generally, design coding is a process. There is no one solution to any one site. There is no standard approach to this. Everything is specific, depends on the area, requires a full analysis. All the stuff that we've been talking about in terms of process needs to be applied right at the beginning of an understanding and a baseline understanding of a site. A clear vision needs to be set out, which then is supported by what we call a coding plan, or that might be a master plan that sets out what the key issues are and what the requirements might be, are then put into a code, which is a specific sort of set of requirements. Next slide. Master planning is another way of looking at this on specific sites, particularly in the Winchester context, where you might identify specific areas for improvement. You need to think about what to include in those principles. And Matthew Carmona at UCL has dubbed some aspects of this as coordinating codes, that is, bringing together a series of requirements that include movement, space, green, density, building form, to set out the parameters or the framework for development. They don't need to be very detailed or complicated, or they can be as complicated as they need to be depending on the circumstances that might arise, say a conservation area or a sensitive infill in a village, for example. Another aspect which I think is really important for the Winchester context is the importance of landscape-led master plans. That is, how does the landscape come first in terms of determining what the built form might then become? And again, a code could be produced which is as much landscape as built form led. Next slide. These are all the parameters that are listed out in the National Model Design Code document. It doesn't cover them all, and it might actually be seen a little bit as a checklist. It's not intended to be that way. There are aspects that will be important to some sites and not to others. But this is just a starter for 10 in terms of what the issues might be. Some of the principles around coding, though, is that whereas the words become really important, you would expect fewer words and more images to support those words. It needs to be relevant, i.e. not copied and pasted or simply repeated from other documents. It needs to be specific and relevant to that particular site. Wherever possible, it can be or needs to be numeric, i.e. how numbers and specific requirements might actually be woven into the general requirement. This is important in terms of distinguishing between codes and guides, what is a must, what is a should, and what is a could. And those distinctions between language become very important in determining where the effectiveness of a code. Final point is that codes are often seen as being in some way restrictive. They ought not to be. They ought to allow for creativity. There again might be some contexts where being a bit more specific or precise is important, but actually a good design code will not constrain the architectural interpretation coming forward. Next slide. I won't go into this. Helen has explained this in very good order in terms of the importance of community engagement throughout. So whereas the process might actually be quite well set out in terms of analysis to a coding plan, at every stage of the way, you need to think about how you engage the community and get their support. It needs to be based on community preferences and aspiration through a structured approach. There are various ways of describing this, whether it's provably popular or demonstrably popular. But I just think that there needs to be an evidence base that sits behind the decision making for any site that can be referred to that demonstrates that communities have had their say. That involves everyone, so it's not just voices that you normally hear. It needs to be engaging people who actually have an ordinary point of view and an ordinary sort of interaction with their environment. So everyone needs to be involved ideally. Lots of techniques, lots of ways of doing it. I'd add to Helen's point about design review to say communities need to be engaged in those review panels wherever possible. And of course, digital engagement has made a significant difference to the level at which engagement can occur. So engage digitally as well as in person. Next slide. Another principle behind design codes is about who owns them, how flexible they might be, and how they relate to other documents. So really, ideally, a design code ought not to be simply repeating anything that might be said elsewhere. It needs to be specific. It needs to be owned by the community and the local authority and bought into by developers. The format for these is quite interesting. Those authorities with a good GIS system, of which there are many, you can build a GIS format for a design code and weave it into your systems that enable interface with users, which might include officers, the public, and developers and landowners. So they also need to be enforced, and to be enforced, I think they need to have a proper oversight and application from officers. And they also are not frozen in time. They need to be thought of in terms of policy change or local plan change. So they need to be updated and not left to languish as a document on the shelf. Next slide. I'm just going to rattle through some of the key issues that I think are important in terms of the code. We've talked about context. I like that mantra, context, context, context. That is particularly important, I think, in the very sensitive areas of the wider Winchester area. So a real focus needs to be on that context study, on the similarity of area types within a city or within some of the market towns or villages, the importance of architectural heritage, character, and character is also about landscape assessment. So character is as much to do with topography and the natural landscape as it is to do with the buildings. Climate comes into that, culture comes into that. So all of it is a full appreciation of the context in which you're operating. Next slide. Built form, clearly a sort of sensitive issue for everyone at the moment in terms of densities, in terms of mass, form, how the form relates to the city wide or the townscape or the village context, and how aspects of form such as roofscape, materiality, and the construction, the detailing, and how the code can actually sort of be quite specific around some of those particular issues in terms of materiality and construction detailing, which very often can get lost as development moves from the planning stage, the coding stage, into reality. How do we ensure that we get the detailing right? Next slide. Movement, we've talked about a real issue across Winchester broadly in terms of how you connect into a strategic network. A really good reference to the movement plan in the Winchester local plan. How do you link the villages? How do you create more reliance on public transport and less reliance on the car? And very specifically, how do you integrate cars into the built environment in a sensitive way? And how do you do it with landscaping? Some really good examples of all of that within the Winchester context already. So that is a question of continuing more important focus on movement strategies. Next slide. Natural environment always will come up as being a key ingredient, respecting and enhancing it. And there are lots of guidance out there at the moment in terms of green infrastructure standards, urban greening factors. So how do you embed that into design codes and make it specific to that particular area? Issues to do with biodiversity and flood mitigation and so on will become quite important ingredients to what a design code should contain. Next slide. Public spaces, so this is not just about how buildings are looking and how the landscape works, but also how we shape the spaces between buildings. Enclosure ratios referred to very much in the context of the National Model Design Code, how social interaction can be encouraged and how you ensure safety and security. Again, all these issues could be part of a code. Finally, next slide. Finally, on management, this often gets forgotten and is a really important ingredient to aspects of place. So it's not just how you design it, but how you look after it over time. And the code can include reference to how places are stewarded, what landscape, what water management systems there might be, how adaptation and mitigation works, and effectively how you involve the community in some of those decisions for the long-term good of place. And so just the final slide from me next is I was interested that Helen mentioned another 2 C's in her presentation, but I've listed out some of the things that I think need to be aspects of any local authority's sort of armory, if you like, in terms of delivering success. So capability, having the expertise and the leadership, which is in good supply in Winchester, I would argue. Consultation, a really positive engagement that's open and transparent. We talked about collaboration, the importance of involving developers and landowners in some of these decisions around coding and around getting the quality right. They need to, at the end of the day, be committed to this, and they need also to be committed to appointing good architects, good designers to help deliver some of that. Clear expectations set out by the local authority in terms of development. I'd also endorse what Helen has said about the importance of design review in the process. A code is something that is capable of being interpreted in the right and the wrong way. It needs to be overviewed. You need to be involved in it. And finally, on confidence, I think a lot of local authorities have backed off the sort of quality agenda over time, not including Winchester in that, but many others, because it's seen that quantity trumps quality, and so quantity of housing becomes the most important criteria. I would argue now that government has seen them as equal, and that there is a sort of balance between the two to be struck, and that should give confidence to officers to deliver on the quality agenda. I might have gone over time. I apologise for that, and pass back to Adrian.
But while Adrian's getting his slides up, just going to say thank you very much to Helen and to Andy. Some really thought-provoking things, and I thought I knew everything, but I was still writing things down madly while you were talking. There is one question which it seems a relevant one to ask at this point in time. It's got unknown user, but it's got initials of HN. The pilots for design codes have indicated that design codes are becoming more like design guides when applied at district-wide scale. Have you got any views on this? Helen or Andy, do you want to start answering that one?
Helen, have a go, and then I'll chip in.
It's a really interesting question, because actually I was involved with Design Southeast in the phase 1 pilot process. We worked with Portsmouth City Council. I've actually got a feeling that my colleague from Portsmouth then may be on this call now, so hello if you are, and you might have some other thoughts. But I think this question of, in a way, Andy has talked about it when he mentions the could, should and the must. And I think there was this was a question that we talked about an awful lot. Our role in that, in our partnership with Portsmouth, was about helping them to actually develop not a design code as such, but a guide to how to design code. So a sort of mini national model design code, if you like, which was about really helping all stakeholders who might be involved in this state renewal across the council. So whether that's the architects, the developers, the engagement team within Portsmouth City Council, the planning officers, the DM officers, could actually pick this up and sort of think through the process of design coding, so that when they're building design codes, they're really asking the right questions. Andy's flagged what lots of those questions are that need to be asked about, but I think Andy articulated the difference between a must and a should or a could in, the relationship between a guide and a code. And I think that personally, and Andy may want to come in and correct me, my feeling is that a code just needs to be clear, whether it's being a could or a should or a must. A code, if we're being very kind of precise and clinical about it, is numerical and quantifiable, if you like.
Yeah.
But
I agree with all of that.
Yeah,
sorry,
Andy, No, I was just going to say that I think so long as there's a clarity in the code about what it is that it's asking for, that's what matters. And as Andy said, that having a scheme reviewed against this document afterwards is where there can be some interpretation, and why it needs an expert set of eyes to make sure that it's not being misinterpreted. Andy, I'm sure you've got other thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the question, because I think there's been a bit of, in my mind, a bit of confusion generated by this requirement that all local authorities should provide an area-wide code for their whole area. And in fact, I'm working with a local authority at the moment that's trying to do just that. And it presents quite a few challenges, because when you want to be very specific about a context, for example, a settlement has its own character, you want to be quite precise about how you think a developer or an architect should respond to that character. So, and how you do that at a sort of a borough-wide level, it can be quite difficult. So I think there's a balance to be struck between understanding the context in which you're operating in more detail, and having a general aspiration for that particular place, and making sure that there's a sort of commonality where the common issues might arise. For example, there might be an issue around movement, transport, parking in Winchester as a whole, that you deal with those as a common thread, but that you don't neglect the importance of the local context. And that I think your local plan Reg 18 actually allows for that, because it's wanting to be specific about the nature of development or improvement in specific areas. So don't let go of the context is my argument there.
I was just
Can
going
I
to come back in and say, the other point I was just going to say was I think the process, keep using that word, process of design coding is as much about knowing what to code for and what not to code for. And that's context specific for the scale of the development and the type of code that will therefore be relevant and applicable.
I think it's really interesting because a lot of the conversation at the scrutiny of this before it went out was about whether the word should be could, should or must in the local plan.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that the lawyers go should because it gives them the opportunity to argue the case later on. But I think it's a debate we must carry on till we get to the Reg 19 stage so that we make sure that, as you say, it's clear whether the local plan says should, but the design code says must.
Yeah.
That's the first thing I'd just like to explore. But the second one is the conversation about design code in pure building terms of whether it's the code or it becomes pastiche in an area, particularly because we have a lot of areas where they're regenerating actually effectively. They're just buildings that have been taken out and replaced by others. And we have to be careful that we're having the opportunity for innovation as well as just responding to the design code. I wonder if you've got any views on that?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Go on, Andy.
Yeah, well, absolutely right. I mean, I think the danger of coding is that it becomes a sort of a blueprint for repeating what's already there, as opposed to something that allows for and encourages innovation. Mm-hmm. And to that extent, I think you need to be careful not to be too specific around the kind of development that you might expect to see. It can talk about principles of roof form or even what the use of materials might be. It's so important in the countryside aspect, particularly in terms of use of materials. So you can actually be quite precise about some of that. But in terms of how a good designer interprets that, ought to be left to designers. You should be encouraging innovation. You should be encouraging new thinking rather than sort of doing a blueprint for the past. And design codes might be important in some areas, as I said before, where it is important that you replicate or that you create a sort of a more sympathetic intervention. But by and large, I would say design codes need to encourage innovation.
Thank you. I'm going to pass back to Adrian now, but meanwhile, it's an opportunity for you to put your questions in chat, and I'll also put up the participants list so I can see if anybody just wants to put their hand up. So I'm going to pass back to Adrian. At the moment, we're curiously empty of questions. I can't believe that. You've done such an amazing job. So I'll put the participants, and if you want to put your hand up, please feel free.
Thank you, Councillor Porter. Yeah, it's really, we've got a lot of village design statements that are undertaken by local communities, and it's obviously how they can transition, I guess, into local design codes, because obviously local residents may not have the access to the skill set that obviously yourself and Helen have got. So it's really basically how can we help them on that journey, kind of think, obviously to move towards local design codes, because I think that's the intention, is that we kind of segue into local design codes from village design statements. I know we've got a number of communities just starting on that, so I just wondered if it was worthwhile just having a quick conversation about that in terms of any immediate thoughts about how that could happen. Thank you.
Helen, do you want to kick off?
Well, yeah, because I think what was really interesting, Adrian, when we carried out the workshop with the market towns and rural villages, and I don't know whether there's anybody here from those areas who attended that workshop on that day. I think, again, it just comes back to this continuous iterative process of engagement with local people. Part of the challenge of engaging local people in design coding is that design coding in itself is quite a sort of technical thing. It's actually a tool to help the technical specialists. In other words, the architects and designers at the end of the day come up with something that is the right, most appropriate design for that place. When you're talking with local people, they often don't think about the places that they live in the same way. And often then it comes back to that question of I like this and I don't like this, rather than can you get from A to B? When you're taking your kids to school, do you have to cross a busy road, and is there a lack of a convenient crossing point, so actually by getting local people to start to think about their daily lives, their quality of life, ease, use, function, and the sort of nature of the environment that they're living and working in, that's the best starting. It has to start with the sort of experiential dimension for local people, and I think through that process of then sort of upskilling in a way local people to think about the impact of design on their lives, then they start to engage with the more, if you like, sort of technical aspects of how things are actually put together to shape the world that they live in, that they inhabit, that they most of the time, 90% of the time, is just the sort of the background to their lives until we ask them to think about it.
Yeah, I think there's another question here which actually ties up with that, which is to what extent can local design codes specify or encourage a 15-minute neighbourhood? In our conversations sort of informally before we published this paper, most people said they wanted to be reasonably close to a medical facility and they wanted public transport. And those two things we are not in control of. All we can do is say how important it is to the public and work with those organisations. How does that work in other authorities?
Interesting question. Yeah, 15-minute neighbourhoods in some parts of your local authority are quite challenging to deliver, I would imagine. So it becomes much more important for the strategic. And I think design codes can sort of look at how you deliver on the strategic aspects of the wider local authority. It doesn't need to be just specifically to do with a village or a town, market town, or its connection with or with the city itself. I think it, as I said before, the design code is in two bits really. One is what is local, and then what is strategic. And so there could be some aspects that get pulled out from local issues to become more strategic, such as a movement network. But clearly there are limits to what uses you can dictate within a local plan, within a local code. You can't predetermine how the market will respond to various aspects of amenities that get supplied, but you can certainly allude to the importance of mixed use and to public facilities within a local plan, a local design code. And
certainly we found that even by putting down these words on paper, it has encouraged those other authorities and organisations to start conversations with us and have conversations. So it's got to be there.
Yeah.
And we must keep working on it. That's us as a community going back to them. So
I think I'm just going to say, I think the important thing is to recognise the limitations also of design. That this is about spatial planning. It's not about deciding how the public health bodies, where they're going to locate their surgeries. There's a limit to what a design code can code for. It can put in place the tools to ease people's movement and so on, but it can't. It's just really sort of being clear, I think, at the outset about what spatial planning is and isn't about.
Okay, Kate, do you have a question? Or perhaps a point to make? I don't know which. You'll need to put your microphone on. That's it. Can you put your microphone on, please? Just press the little microphone image so it comes up.
Okay.
That's it. We're on now. Yeah, perfect.
Well, first of all, congratulations on a very inspiring report, document generally. I was particularly pleased about the bit that you're not defining the number of parking spaces on new developments, but speaking that developers have to justify what they aim to put in. In my book, the car is the enemy of convivial social interaction. And I live in the Westgate area of Winchester, and I wonder whether, looking at the city in particular, you're moving towards taking out more parking spaces, both private and public, within the city in order to further encourage sustainable transport modes of travel. The removal of parking from St Peter's car park, that's very welcome, and also another park and ride to serve the northern end of the city. But streets like Jury Street are still horrendous quality of air quality there, and I've been pressing for years for Sussex Street to be made two-way, so that the Gladstone Street, Newburgh Street and Upper High Street can be restored to their character as primarily residential streets, and that we're very short on north-south connection between the end of Romsey Road and the Alton Road, and that would allow taking out the right-hand turn at the end of Sussex Street into Upper High Street and extending the footpath there to include the monument, producing another potential social space. Sorry if that's a bit too detailed.
Thank you, Kate. I think that the interesting thing you've raised there, which hasn't been raised by any movement strategy process, is the principle of restoring back to a residential street. The air quality management area is as it is, and it includes all of the places you've just described. And we're very keen, actually, as part of our local plan and part of our public protection process and healthy living and for all, to go to the World Health Organization standards for air quality, not just for the standards set for us under the AQMA. And we're really keen to make sure that happens. So if that means that we have to reduce car travel, but we are bearing in mind that many people have relations and friends that live outside the area of public transport. So taking away cars completely is never going to be, I don't think, a plan, but certainly trying to reduce the impact on the residential streets is really important. And I welcome that introduction of the words residential streets into ones in the centre of Winchester, because people tend to think of them as streets to transport traffic rather than streets to transport people. And I think that's a real takeaway for me today. So thank you. Adrian, do you want to comment?
Could I just insert one further thing? We talk a lot about public space, but
yeah,
the major public spaces we have are our streets. They should not be predominantly simply conduits for transport.
No, thank you. Would either of our contributors like to comment on that point? Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Kate. In principle, I don't know the specifics of the places that you refer to in detail, but the design guide and the code work that we did puts a real focus on the safety, the amenity, the public engagement that you have, the interactions that you have socially on the street, rather than just seeing them as ways of moving people through places. And in some ways, you know, the pedestrianised area of Winchester City is a wonderful interaction of people, and yet around it there seems to be a sort of racetrack of people passing through. So it's about how you put more priority on the pedestrian, on the cyclist. How do you make it safe for both, and how do you use buses in the right way? I'm a great advocate of smaller buses more frequently used so that they don't impact so heavily on pedestrians. But you know, who am I? I'm just I have a point of view about those things. But yeah, I totally agree. And the design code can deliver on some of those issues. And in fact, there is specific section in the design guide about it. So
thank you. Jonty Sherwell, would you like to speak? You've put your hand up. And thank you, Kate. Is Jonty there? Hands up.
Might need to unmute, Jonty.
Can't see him. Perhaps not there.
I think Jonty's got his microphone muted.
Aha. If you can hear that. Has anybody else got to get a question while we're waiting for Jonty to sort out his microphone?
You might be able to unmute Jonty for him. Whoever's host, the meeting host might be able to unmute.
Bethany, can you do that?
Yeah.
I've had a look. I can't unmute them. I can only mute participants, not unmute.
Yeah. We've got another question in the chat,
Right.
Councillor Porter,
Yeah.
from
Do read it, and then I'll see if we can get Jonty.
so we've got one from Tim. Well, Tim, are you there, Tim? I know you've got an urban design experience. Is Tim there?
Hello, sorry.
Hello. Yeah. Tim, do you want to read out your question, please?
Yeah, it's more of a conversation point as much as anything else, really, and it's Winchester specific, but it probably could be specific across the country. But one of my takes is, in practice, a lot, particularly with applications and things like that, design's quite far down the agenda because the principle is the dominant factor. And I wondered what everyone's opinion is, and it's a slightly revolutionary and not the most politically attractive position, but why don't we allocate more sites to truly make things a beauty contest, first past the post approach, whereby that way the plan process identifies a greater quantum of sites that should be appropriate for development over potentially a longer period of time, or just generally, but then the sites that are delivered and the developers that deliver them are the ones that truly deliver on the promises they make. They put the emphasis in the design quality, they produce the design codes, and that way design is higher up the agenda, which in practice and in just across the country, because there's so many other technical matters which potentially can fall down at appeal or from a legal perspective, and design, as we all know, is very much based on opinion, it always gets pushed further down the agenda. So one of my blue sky thoughts was, I've always wondered, and this seemed a good opportunity to pin you down, Adrian, is why not allocate more sites? Why not make it a first past to the post and a proper beauty contest, rather than it just being words, which I appreciate are more nationally driven from the national government in terms of talking about beauty and things. But I think that, to me, that's one of the ways you could truly put that into practice. So I'll get off my soapbox. It's not necessarily a specific thing, but interested to know what Helen and Andy's views on that are really as well, to be honest, to see if I'm completely mad or if it is something that potentially has merit.
Who wants to start?
I think it's a super interesting point that you're raising. I suppose I'm not entirely clear why first past the post would necessarily imply good design quality, but I guess what you're saying is if it was allocated and therefore it had to have a code, then there would be some regulation of design quality through the coding process. I think if I've understood what you're saying. I think that one of the points I was going to make really was about that is a phrase that I used before, which is that, you know, the design quality management process. Again, it comes back down to the process, and part of the onus of responsibility, I guess, for the good design outcome sits also with those within the council seeing the application through the pre-app process and ensuring that they're setting the bar high through those conversations. And if they don't necessarily feel they've got the expertise to be able to give the right advice, certainly using design review panels, but looking at other mechanisms to get the right expertise around the table to ensure that by the time it gets to the submission point, it's going to be a good quality one, whether it's an allocated site or not. That was just a sort of starter for 10.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the European model of, you know, design competitions is a great idea. It's just we've gone off that, haven't we, in recent generations, actually. I mean, I remember design competitions where the way in which many a site was allocated to developers. But I wonder whether, you know, design codes done well wouldn't obviate or, you know, would avoid that particular scenario. Developers need to work with good architects at the end of the day. You need a really committed developer who wants to produce good design. You need a local authority that has set out very clearly what good design means to them, and that's the purpose of the code. And with those two ingredients, I think developers are bound to have to appoint good designers, and there are plenty of talented designers who understand the balance between development, quality, how to produce value, and that, you know, that value proposition is not always achieved through design competitions. So you know, I think it's a good idea, but I don't think that's the direction of travel that we're likely to be heading in. That's my point of view.
Adrian, do you have a view? Thank you, Helen and Andy. Adrian, do you have a view on this?
Thank you, Councillor Porter. I do think hopefully by embedding the design process into the local plan and making it very, very clear that obviously that's what we want people to follow. And also, obviously, we would hope that obviously developers, architects see the opportunity from a marketing perspective in terms of obviously creating high quality design means that basically they can sell a product, you know, basically, you know, obviously quicker. And obviously it's more attractive to local people. It's got the buy-in of the local community. So I think it's a kind of an issue of obviously just raising the bar and making sure that we show as a local authority we are serious about the design process. And that will be incorporated into the kind of the validation checklist. Obviously, we want basically people to demonstrate clearly that they've gone through that thought process. And then obviously, if they don't do it right, when it goes to the design panel, Helen and her team will pick it up. There's nothing to hide from Helen. Basically, when she does those design review panels, she unpicks everything. So it's in everybody's interest to do it, because if you end up at the design review panel, they will be asking you those challenging questions. What about this? Have you thought about that? And you'll have to go back to square one. So it's all that iterative process that it's in everybody's best interest to do it correct at the first time and to involve local communities and to think and challenge themselves that they are doing it correct. Because like I say, there's nowhere to hide if you end up at the design review panel. They will unpick it. So thank you.
I was also just going to add that actually design review as a sort of as a thing is a more formal part of the planning process, perhaps, you know, nearer to submission of an application. There is also, you know, the opportunity to have a design workshop that's much more about the structuring principles, the design principles for a scheme, very early stages with an applicant team to make sure that they're setting off on the right, that wiggly path that I showed in that diagram. You know, if you make sure that that sets off in the right direction, you've got a much better chance of it ending up in the right place. So kind of agreeing at that point about, you know, collaborating, getting everybody around the table early days to kind of agree the kind of aspiration and the direction of travel is a really important part of that.
I think it's really interesting that some developers take it and you feel it's just a tick box exercise, and some you feel there is a genuine conversation all along the way. And it's a bit like the local plan in the sense you have a conversation about the issues and policies and priorities. Then you have a conversation about what the principles of design are, and then you get to the point where you think this is what we're going to be putting forward. And it's nice to see a developer that's doing that sort of process as opposed to a one-off. You go along, they can say how many people have actually been to it, but not what their actual opinions are. So I think that part of our conversation, the point I keep making about the local plan is it's a conversation rather than a confrontation. And it is a conversation that we want to have with people. And actually part of this is on the front page of the consultation is, do you have a plan? Do you have another site you'd like to submit? Because actually that ties back to your question, I think, which is, you know, if you think you've got something better, then this is the point to say it, because this is the point in which it will be not easy, but it certainly is an opportunity to put something back in. So I hope that answers your question, and to feel that it's not a closed conversation, it's a closed process. It's a conversation that we want to take. Go on, Helen, you wanted to say something?
I'm just going to say that the site allocation process is such a critical part of ensuring design quality, because to come back to that discussion around design and sustainable, you know, good design and sustainable design being one and the same thing. If you allocate the wrong sites that are not sustainable sites, because they're going to by necessity become very, you know, car dependent places, then you're never going to end up with good design quality, because the places are going to be dominated by cars, because in order to live there, people are only going to live there if they've got cars. So just to sort of wheel that back really to thinking about this as a process, site allocation is almost step one of ensuring design quality by making sure that the right sites are allocated.
And hopefully we're some way towards that now.
Yeah.
But we're also very realistic. We're also a very rural community.
Yes.
And we will have places where actually, oh, sorry, the light's just gone, I've not moved fast enough. Where actually we've got to be realistic about what that means. There's one last question, I think, probably. It's 125. Design codes are usually known as vision implementation tools. Do you expect that Winchester would produce a vision defining design code?
Yeah, well, vision is such a vital ingredient to any design code. So it's great to assess what the context is, i.e. what the local area that you're trying to transform is. But one of the key aspects of any code is having a very clear idea of what you want that place to be in the future. So it doesn't sort of work. A design code doesn't work unless you've got that sort of idea. In terms of producing one for the whole of the local authority, it's quite tricky. You have to do this on a site by site, almost area by area or area types approach. And by that, I mean, you can take very specific types of development and decide that you want them to be changed or improved or designed differently. So it doesn't have to be exactly replicating what's already there. It needs to have a vision for it to work. So that's one of the clear outputs that needs to come from the engagement process with communities. What do they want their place to be? And that requires the workshopping, the early iterations. And the point I make about the earlier discussion or the discussion before is that schemes coming forward need to engage positively right at the beginning. So often you have schemes coming forward that you're told to approve or to consider before a proper process has been set up. So it's about having really early engagement on that and deciding on what the vision is with the community.
Thank you. Adrian, thank you very much for the interesting questions. We perhaps didn't have as many as we were expecting in terms of questions, but I think we've managed to explore some of the issues within those questions, which has been really helpful. Adrian, would you like to finish off? But before you do, I'd just like to say thank you to our speakers, Helen Goodwin and Andy Worobrowski. Thank you, who have really made us think. And as I said, I've written so many notes, I can't believe it. But also to all of you for coming today and to taking an active and interesting part in today's event. But also, I do hope you will respond to the local plan. It's really important that we get not just with the working public, the interested developers, designers, architects, absolutely everybody responding to the local plan, and your input will be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much to Andy and to Helen. I'm passing over to you to close, Adrian.
Thank you, Councillor Porter. Thank you, Helen and Andy and the participants. Really appreciate that. Remember, it's your place, your plan. There's a QR code. We will be sending out the presentation to everybody who's attended. Thank you very much for your contribution. Please let us know if there's something we can improve in the policies, because we are keen to hear from you about how we can improve design and obviously embed the design process into obviously our main thinking about how we approach things in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think the recording can now stop, Bethany. Thank you.